In this interview, I talk with my friend Jamie Arpin-Ricci. Jamie is an author, speaker, and activist. He lives and serves at the intersection of faith, sexuality, and community renewal. He identifies as bisexual, pansexual, queer. He serves as a pastoral leader of Little Flowers Community, an urban Mennonite congregation. Enjoy. What'd you think of that intro that I created with my own skills?
It's very, very reminiscent of other experiences I've had in
Yes,
my past life.
yes. I was going for like a timeless quality. So today I'm interviewing Jamie Arpin-Ricci.
Ricci, that's correct. No one gets that
I
right.
always trick
Generally.
because I remember like you've mentioned the mispronunciation of your name, and so I didn't know
Yeah.
which way to zig or zag.
Well, it should be Ricci, but my great great grandfather, we think, wanted to anglicize the sound of it, so he changed it to Ricci.
It's spelled the same way as like Christina Ricci, right?
Yep.
Who
Yeah.
I
Fairly
who I
common
had
name.
who I've had a crush on my entire adult life.
Who hasn't?
I mean, yeah, she's just adorable.
Especially. Yeah, anyway.
We could get derailed there, but although it does kind of connect because I feel like a lot of the characters she plays do fit into the category of someone who could be a queer icon.
Absolutely, definitely
Especially
resist.
Lizzie Borden, like that's
Fair enough.
like gender influenced mass murder. That's something
Well,
fierce about that.
then she also played Wednesday Addams, didn't she?
Yeah, that's totally consummate outsider, neurodivergent, although they didn't use that term. There's lots of,
Oh yeah,
as we all know, there's overlap between neurodivergence and queerness,
absolutely.
which is part of our superpower. Um, so yeah, we're interviewing Jamie Arpin-Ricci about your faith and queer experience. And to me, like I know a bunch of this, so I'm going to try to like force myself into ignorance so I can be a curious interviewer. But like I don't know, like maybe you could start with your faith journey.
Sure.
Yeah, like start there, and then we'll jump over to the queerness thing, and then the where those two things hit and what happened after that.
Exactly.
I feel like that's a good way to approach this.
Yes,
So,
the Reese peanut butter cup of combinations there,
yeah.
right? Well, I was raised in a small town in northwestern Ontario. My parents were fairly recent converts from nominal Catholicism to evangelicalism.
Yay.
And the whole family, kind of like extended family, all became evangelicals around the same time. And so that was all I knew growing up. Like my brother had been baptized in the Catholic Church, but by the time I was born, they had left that. And for the first few years, actually, especially on my mom's side, was French Canadian Catholic, where Catholicism is a huge part of identity, and leaving that is connected to kind of colonialist oppression from the English. My mom lost connection to her family for quite some time, and so and this relates to my faith and sexuality journey later on. But here I am as someone who is half French Canadian, but had lost connection to that part of my identity. And so I was raised in this evangelical context, and I don't know how old I was, probably 11 or 12, when my parents are like at their wits' end what to do with me, because I wasn't interested in any sports. I found hunting like completely offensive, because of all the machismo that went with it. And I was majorly into theater. I mean, I don't know why people didn't see the signs, but I was a walking stereotype. And so they tried to.
Father, can I Can I desist from the hunting so that I might prance about the stage?
Well, I was more militant than that. I was like, Dad, if you hang a deer in our backyard, I will cut it down and bury it in the night. Like, that's what I was like. He's like, you damn well won't. I'm like, try me.
Nice.
My views on hunting have changed for ecological reasons. But anyway, like they forced me into Cub Scouts, which was like horrific experience of bullying and like had some good friends, but it was awful. And so eventually I said, if I'm going to fit in, if I'm going to be left alone, I need to have something that's my niche. And so it was like, well, I can be the good Christian kid. And when my church said, we're going to have a theater, like a drama club, I'm like, there we go. And so that became my in, right? And I just doubled down on being like the good Christian kid, became the student council president of my Christian school, and I was the one who's like, on graduation, I'm going to give up all my scholarships and bursaries for university and become a missionary because that's true faithfulness, which I did. And I joined Youth with a Mission, YWAM.
You just said something that just clicked in my head, and it makes all kinds of sense. And maybe this is obvious to you and to everyone else, but it makes sense that if you're a queer kid, whether you know it or not, and are uncomfortable with the sort of usual things that you would do, that the church would provide this alternative outlet. Like this.
Absolutely.
It's like the reason why, gay Catholic men sometimes become priests.
Yeah.
It's like, well, I can't do the other stuff. I can do this, the pomp, the drama, and
the theater,
and I can kind of blend into this. And for me, like, I became super Christian. I didn't think about it as had anything to do with queerness because it was deep. I was deep in there, but it was like, okay, this is a place that has more crayons for me to color with, where I can be sensitive, I can be wimpy, I can be effeminate in some ways. Like rural Minnesota. I know you have Minnesota roots too.
Yeah, born in Minnesota.
Yeah, rural Minnesota, like you have these staunch, stoic, conservative farmer types who still, like in a charismatic church situation, will get weepy and wave and dance. And those are very feminine things in our society. So so thank you. You just
absolutely
kind of made this thing click. Like it makes sense. And then how tragic is it, the betrayal of that then?
Oh, absolutely.
These people like you who are like, faith is, these church contexts are a place where I feel more comfortable, but it's a place where you actually, I know you thrived and found vocation, and then all of a sudden to have, well, I don't want to jump ahead with the story. The betrayal part will come later in Act
absolutely
2.
And how.
So sorry for derailing a bit.
No, that's great. Jump in like that all the time. Yeah. So for me, it became this thing where I doubled down on this identity because it was an identity that was praised by my family and my church. And it was something, I mean, again, I don't want to put too much emphasis on the acting bit, but it's like the fact that so many queer folks end up in theater is not just like a funny stereotype. It's because we spend a lifetime learning how to pretend effectively because the stakes are so high. And it wasn't that my faith was fake, but it was, this is something I can do well. And it also, when you wrap it up with the shame and fear of like, if you don't, then it's like there's other motivations for doubling down, because it's like, if I don't do this well, I'm going to hell, right? And
womp womp.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, and there wasn't a lot of me that was self-aware of that. There was parts of me that were a little bit later on, but early on, it just was like, I believed the lie enough that it was real to me. And the impacts of that are still having major repercussions today. But I went on, I graduated from high school a year early and went to become a missionary with Youth with a Mission, YWAM, and spent 25 years serving with YWAM, which a couple years ago came to a glorious end. So that's kind of my faith trajectory.
A little bit of a Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. And for those of you who are boomers or Gen Xers, you might understand that reference.
Yeah, and like throughout that journey into YWAM, because YWAM, so to add some nuance, so when I went to this evangelical church in my rural community. It wasn't big enough to have really a youth group. And so consistently anyway, so I ended up going to a youth group in a neighboring community, which was Pentecostal. So I went to, I attended this evangelical church, attended a Pentecostal youth group, went to a very traditional, like almost colony Mennonite Christian school, and then occasionally went to mass with my French Catholic grandmother. And so like I had a very, and I think positively diverse exposure to faith. And so YWAM seemed to be a good fit. And probably about 10, 15 years into my YWAM journey, I started realizing that my own spirituality was more Anabaptist of a variety than anything else. But to this day, it's like Tom Sine, last time I was with Tom Sine, he kept pulling me aside. He goes, let me get this straight. You're a evangelical missionary who identifies as a Mennonite but writes books about Catholic saints? I'm like, yeah. And he goes, I'm confused. Like he said that to me like 3 times. I mean, yeah, I get it. I'm confusing. So that was kind of my faith journey.
But there's something about that, like there's something very Canadian about that. So this is the interesting thing. Like your experience, like the diversity there, I feel like it's not like Canada is wonderfully diverse in all the right ways, but there is still more access to that kind of those sorts of like Mennoniteness in Canada and Anabaptism in Canada has more of a sense of rootedness than in a lot of places here, although it depends on where you're at. But then also the French Catholic thing, yeah, all this stuff.
Yeah, and like it's a mix of good and bad. But like even my family now, like I'm married to an Australian. I have a son who was born in Ethiopia. I was born in the States, and my daughter was born in Canada. So there's 4 of us in my family, and none of us were born in the same country. And so it just seems like that kind of diversity is an ongoing presence in my life. And yeah, it's just something that I value, but it's not something that I've ever like intentionally pursued. It just seemed to be a natural outpouring of my trajectory in life.
Well, and it seems like, in a just world where YWAM doesn't suck, like that idea of global faith could be a beautiful, wonderful thing. Like if YWAM were filled with compassion in a way that did not have judgment, you could have been. That would have been a perfect context for you.
Well, and in many ways, I believed it was going to be. And again, I don't want to get ahead of ourselves here, but what ended up happening was I believed, and to a certain degree, I received more freedom within YWAM Canada, and I had perhaps naively believed that I could explore that diversity and bring that diversity. But then eventually I crossed a line and everything switched. And it got to the point where in a community that I spent more than half of my life serving, where the majority of the people I counted as friends, as close as and sometimes closer than family, I have maybe 5 of those people in my life anymore. Like the rest, they're just gone, And so it was a stark shift.
Yeah, and just for those who are watching who aren't familiar with something like, I feel like we have to pivot to the YWAM story.
Yes.
But so for those who don't know, because a lot of people don't know what YWAM is, and then if you say like, well, you don't know what YWAM is, they act like you're an idiot. But I'm like, it's the world's largest missions organization. It's not like some sort of fringe thing.
Yeah.
They're everywhere.
Yeah.
It stands for Youth with a Mission. It's basically a missionary organization that basically brings the youngins up to be missionaries in a way, and then does a lot of stuff around the world. But it has some better manifestations of it. And then there's some really nasty shit ones that are tied into like Nigerian oppression. So like there's,
Yeah. Well, and the thing is that it's also impacted by current social and political movements. And like, since around, 2016, things got really ugly. And because even though I was part of their international missions organization. The power really still stayed with a small group of older white men in that were mostly, not exclusive, but mostly American. And and the thing is that YWAM did contain that same kind of diversity that I valued throughout my life, and I think that's what kept me there as long as I did.
Mm-hmm.
Should we wind it back?
Let's go for it. So
okay, well, I mean, I feel like it'd be a good place to start talking about my journey with my sexual identity and what that has meant. And so I remember when I was about 15, like I had no idea that I was queer. Like I had no idea that I was queer, which is people think like, most people think, oh, I knew, but some of us, we find out later.
Yeah, I didn't know till like a few months ago, and I'm 45. So
right, exactly.
Like, it's not everyone doesn't grow up knowing and keeping it a secret. Like sometimes the secret's from yourself. Exactly.
And for some people, even for me realizing at like 15, they say that's really late, but there was reasons for that. And so what basically would happen is, in a rare moment where I was actually playing sports with guys at school, because it was in a social non-competitive context, we all were sitting on the grass sweating and exhausted afterwards. And, one of the guys like, hey, dude, you stink. And he's like, oh, go have a shower. And he goes, stop thinking about me in the shower. And everyone's like, oh, gross. And I remember going, oh, gross. And I'm going, actually, do I think that's gross? And being the nerdy, scientific-minded person I was, I'm like, it is time for an experiment. So I went home and had an imagination experience. And I'm like, oh, shit, I find men sexually attractive. And then I'm like, does that mean I'm gay? Well, that's what it means when you're attracted, if you're a man attracted to a man. So like, but I'm attracted to women, like genuinely attracted to women. And it's like, I'm only partly gay, but because I've never acted on it, I still have hope. And that, because I didn't understand bisexuality or pansexuality, my only framework was the good and holy, straight person. And gender hadn't even crossed my mind at that stage. And then there was the evil, perverted gay, right? And so
the gays.
And again, this is pre-internet. I mean, I'm sure the internet was just starting, but not in my community. And, rural hunting hockey town, Canada. And so I'm like, what the hell do I do with this, right? And so I did what every good Christian did. Every time I was in the city at a Christian bookstore, I'd, as terrified as I was, sneak into the section where there was always a book or two about homosexuality, and I'd read as much as I could before putting it on the back of the shelf and leaving. And so I became indoctrinated with kind of ex-gay mentalities early on. But an interesting thing for me was I never was convinced that I could change. I was like, I cannot change. This is going to be, and I think that was the scientific-minded person of myself. It's like, this isn't like something that's just something I'm going to be like, no, I don't find that attractive anymore. That's kind of a thing. So I said, so my thing is going to be celibate, be good. And, and then of course in my mind, I'm like, and if I do this right, this could be part of my testimony. And this could amplify my Christian clout. Which is true to a degree, but I didn't recognize the cost that it would come at. So I came out, again, I came out at about 16 years old. The first time I came out to someone, some of them were horrific. But all of them, I was still saying, hey, listen, I don't believe this is right. I just want you to know the truth. Right. And so it wasn't like I was accepting as I was coming out. And so I think, after that, my parents were even more eager to see me do missions, because I think, they didn't know how to handle it. To their credit, they never considered sending me off to try to fix me. But I think, they were more willing to let me give up all my bursaries and scholarships to university, because it's like, what's going to happen to him if he goes to a university, like that bastion of sexual deviance and secularism.
It's happening 24/7 at university.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, we heard regularly from Dr. Dobson that was the case. So I went into YWAM, and as time went by over the years in YWAM, I began to realize, as happens often in the queer community, is we find each other. And so I would find that inevitably there were queer students that would be coming through YWAM programs, and they would come to me, and I would end up being the one who would help them come out to the staff or process, but again, from a non-affirming perspective. And, but over time, I begin my ideas begin to change about sexuality and about and it wasn't for probably, I don't know, probably almost 10 years before I began to understand things like that bisexuality was a thing, that I wasn't halfway gay or like halfway too far and things like that. And so I committed, again, the scientific minded person. I committed myself to spend years just reading and researching and I began to realize that I, first of all, doubled down in, not only do I not believe that a person's gender identity or sexual orientation can be fixed or changed, but that any efforts to that end would be severely harmful, which is now thankfully been clinically proven. But I also begin to think, well, maybe I'm not, maybe I don't believe that this is wrong. Like the Bible doesn't clearly say anything about this, if we're honest about it. And, and throughout this, I met the woman who would become my wife, and I'm really grateful that I was out to her before we were even in a relationship, because I feel like that tends to be, for a lot of bisexual folks, that can be a critical piece, that if you're not out to yourself or to your partner before you get married, it's a lot more difficult to process later on. But it was still very difficult for Kim. And, there's always the question, will I be enough? Will you eventually, again, she had the same mentality that there was these two categories, and that eventually I would just be like, no, bisexuality was just a safe place before I accepted I was fully gay. We, both of us know now that that's a bullshit category, when referring to bisexuality legitimately. And I got to the point where privately I was affirming and I was, doing ministry out of that private belief, quite extensively, online and with people locally. And then the Pulse shootings happened. Mm-hmm. And suddenly the Christian witness online and in the media was so violently anti-queer that I was like, I can't do this anymore. And so after talking to Kim, I'm like, I need to be unequivocally clear in a public context that I'm affirming. And
can you give me an example of like that Christian public kind of response that was violent?
Well, sometimes it was subtle, but oftentimes it was even like, well, this wouldn't have happened to them if they hadn't been at, a gay bar. Or it's like, you reap what you sow. It's like, it's tragic, but like all that kind of, and then, the attempts to erase the motivation of queerness of the shooter wasn't acting, it was random. And it's like, again, it was just a constant flow of things that wanted to erase the identities and experience of queer people who have a long history of being violently attacked or neglected or erased. And I'd had enough. So I did this public post. It kind of boomed. And all of a sudden I started getting emails and private messages, at least initially it was over a dozen a day, from people, pastors who were either themselves queer or had someone in their life or in their congregation and just were desperate to talk to someone. And I had enough public platform from my publishing of, Christian books, that, people were like, oh, and started coming to me. And it got so much that, I had to ask my church if I could give, because I was also pastoring our church, Little Flowers Community, which is a Mennonite congregation. But I asked them, I need to give at least half time to this ministry because it's that demanding, and they allowed for it. And then out of that, a year later, someone who I helped out in their own journey nominated me for a local award here for my queer activism, and I won. And I had a choice to accept it or to say, no, I'd rather not. And, my wife and I chose to accept it, and very significantly impacted by the fact that we are the parents of a Black child, and that we would never protect our income and our livelihood at the expense of celebrating who he is. So we're like, okay, how could we do that on this? And so a very big story was done in the local newspaper and on television, and I very creatively avoided the name YWAM and kept everything under my church title and everything. And then the reporter did his own research and said, Little Flowers Community is a partnership between Mennonite Church Manitoba and Youth with a Mission. And of course, one of the international leaders got a news alert. Mm-hmm. And despite it had been over 20 years of service at that point, the international leadership of YWAM reached out to the Canadian leadership, who reached out to me and said, we have a problem. Now here's the thing that's really interesting, is that YWAM at the time had no doctrinal statement or policy statement on this issue, right? And that was by design. So, and it's connected to what you said earlier about how some people are like, how can you not know YWAM? It's this big organization. That's by design. YWAM does not want to be the center of attention because, and I used to think it was out of humility, but in reality, it's out of a very calculated way of avoiding accountability for the impact of some of the negative things that they do. And so there were, basically it was 2.5 years of meetings. We had Canadian leadership staying in our home for a couple of times doing these meetings. There were some of our top level senior leaders in YWAM compared me to a terrorist as a threat to the church in a public letter that went out. It got to the end where it was finally like the Canadian leaders are like, okay, we're going to stand with you. We're going to try to negotiate a way for you to stay. And, you do your work under a different umbrella, we believe. And then basically what happened is YWAM Canada was threatened with expulsion from YWAM. And then there was also internal divisions within the Canadian leadership. And essentially they backed out on all their commitments to us. And we decided to quit. And so I tell people we were forced out of YWAM, and they say, well, didn't you quit? And I'm like, well, we left YWAM in the same way a person leaves a burning building. Like the option, there was no option to stay. They were throwing Molotov cocktails at us. Like, to give you an example, this is on public record on YouTube. The founder of YWAM, Lauren Cunningham, around the time that we were leaving, made several public speeches at huge events in which he talks about dealing with people who want to affirm sin. Like, that language isn't used about, and then he's like, but sin like greed, but no one uses the word affirm with any other topic. No. And the subtext was very clear that it was about us and it was about affirming theology in YWAM. And at one point he said, how do we deal with this kind of false teaching when it's in our mission? And he says, well, let me tell you a story. And he tells a story about this cult that was in Hawaii that they had encounters with. And when they were praying for this group to leave, God told Lauren to pray judgment on this man. And then they got the picture of this man's body being dashed against the rocks. And the next day, the man was killed in a hang gliding accident. And this was basically
what a fucked up story.
Yeah. And it's like, so basically to me, it's like the implication is clear. This is a death threat. Thankfully, I don't think his prayers can kill me, but in his mind, he was saying, if you don't leave, we will pray judgment on you, and that could get you killed. So it's like, and how many public leaders in YWAM called him out for such a story? Publicly, not one. Mm-hmm. I even talked to some reporters, and they're like, yeah, it's horrific, but it's not a story because it's pretty typical. Yeah. So my wife and I left after 2.5 years of, and I say this in the clinical sense, severe trauma. We're still recovering from. We literally transitioned out of YWAM, and the last month that we broke with YWAM was the first month of the pandemic. We lost half of our income as we transitioned under a new ministry. We've slowly built most of that back up, but we lost almost all of our community. Before we had time to shut down our YWAM Google Maps link, which, like tells you about our ministry. Someone in YWAM hacked in and changed our names to Rebels Without a Mission twice.
That's actually sounds like a really good biker gang name, though.
Yeah, exactly.
Have you thought about that?
Well, the thing is, it's like it wasn't the insult they thought it was, but at the same time, it was like it was still felt because they put it on, like it was tagged on our home, and friends saw that, and it was like it took us weeks to get it taken down, then it got put back up, and finally we said to Google, like, we're going to have to start legal procedures if you don't stop this, and they're like, oh yeah, clearly this is, because I gave them the background, but it's like, again, people who I considered like family, and they're like, yeah, but you're the one who we didn't move the goalposts, you did. Funny enough, though, YWAM did add, change their foundational values to exclude, to be very clear about that holy matrimony, not marriage, because they believe that word has now been ruined, but holy matrimony is for only between one man and one woman. And again, even with respect to gender, they have nothing on policy, but if anyone were to make a stink. Anyway, there were a small group of affirming YWAM leaders who were all from around the world who were working with us. A lot of them got threatened. All of the queer members who were on YWAM staff, who were part of that group, have since left YWAM. A number of those leaders have left YWAM. I shouldn't say no desire. I don't have a strong desire to see YWAM taken down. I mean, part of me wants it, but I do believe that, truth telling is an important part of my own healing journey, and the lack of accountability for what was done and said, and I'm just brushing the surface, has had an impact on my own faith. Like it's been very tenuous over the last couple of years as a result, because it makes me think, like, how if the people who were like the epitome of faithfulness suddenly disappeared like that from my life, how authentic is this thing, and yet there are aspects of my spirituality and my faith that I can't let go of.
Mm-hmm. That's actually a good segue to this question. Like, so before I came out, as I was already a leftist anarchist type, and I'd already get questions about, like, why are you messing around with this Christianity bullshit? Why are you doing ministry? Like, the idea of some sort of Jesus spirituality isn't necessarily so bad, but it's tainted to a lot of people. But then if you participate in any way, like in a church, that's like even more suspect. And then if you're in ministry, and if you're doing all those things as a queer person, it just doesn't make any sense to a lot of people. Mm-hmm. So I guess I have two questions with that. Is like, one, why? Like, what is it that Christianity or Jesus or any of this stuff still, why mess with it anymore? Because there's so much betrayal around. That's part one of the question. The second part is, has there been any part of your faith through this kind of experience of coming out more and more publicly, not only affirming of yourself, but others in the queer community, that has kind of deepened your faith or transformed?
Yeah. As for the first question, why? Like, I want to be really vulnerable in that answer, in that I suspect that part of it is a lifetime of conditioning that says this is what you're to believe, and to let go of that, to let go of the moorings and the framework upon which I built not only my life but my livelihood, right? And so there's part of me that I had to be honest with myself. It's like, how much am I holding on to? Because to let go would be, career suicide, and I've got kids to feed, right? Mm-hmm. But I realized that there are things that I didn't want to let go of, and I think the radical teachings and example of Jesus in the context of, his own life in an occupied, marginalized community speaks volumes to how, we live with respect to power in the world, our own power and the power that's used against us. And as someone who, obviously, I'm a white man, I'm cisgender, I occupy a significant amount of privilege, but I'm also a queer man. I'm bisexual, pansexual, and so I have experienced a fair amount of suffering and oppression as well. So I fit into this category of the oppressed oppressor, right? Mm-hmm. And so I have this tension in my life that says, on one hand, I want to work for justice for myself and people like me, but then I also say I also want to be cognizant of the fact that I am the perpetuator of oppression on other groups. And Jesus seems to provide the ethic through which I can engage that most meaningfully. And to me, my faith has little to do with afterlife anymore, which I frankly don't think Judaism or Jesus' teaching generally had a lot to do with the afterlife anyway. But it provides a clear ethic for how I live in the world on behalf of others and myself. And so that's the piece that I hold on to. And there is something bigger than the sum of its parts in that communal experience of faith. There's some bad aspects of it, and I've seen a lot of it be fake and false. But there's parts of it that I'm like, I think I'd probably be dead without it, and so I hold on to it. And I've actually found, I won't go deeply into this one, but I've actually found that a lot of indigenous theologians have provided a lens through which to engage Jesus that helps me kind of untether the...
Sorry, I don't have an answer for that.
Yes, thank you, Alexa. Untether me from the Western expressions of Christianity, right? And so, I listened recently to Randy Woodley on a podcast with Pete Enns, and I find, and I reached out to Randy after this because it's kind of like, I don't want to give up on my faith, but here in the West, in this point of culture and history, Christianity feels like a nationalistic cult that has, the pretense of Judeo-Christian values, but functionally isn't in most places. And so yeah, that's why I hold on. Is there? It still is this core ethic and example in the person of Jesus that keeps me there. Mm-hmm. And your second question was
how, if there's any ways in which your spiritual life has morphed, transformed, or deepened.
Yeah, in a lot of ways, actually, like, and kind of in the more abstract. I was thinking about Dr. Liz Edmonds' book Queer Virtue, and one of her kind of premises is that queerness is a resistance to binary thinking, and I mean, the Trinity is like the most binary resistant concept I think I've ever encountered, and it's central to our spirit. Well, many of our spiritualities. Not all Christians hold to a Trinitarian view, but for me, and to me, my experience of living with a part of my identity that falls outside normative power structures or assumptions helps me engage that kind of queerness that we see in Scripture and in the divine that resists these binaries. And I think it's a gift that queer folk bring to the church in our experience of being outside those binaries. So that's one major aspect. Another major aspect, and this one I think is really important, because we are considered deviant, and I mean that both in the pejorative and in the literal to deviate from sense.
But not in the Marvel Cinematic Universe sense.
No, exactly.
That's a little tie into the Eternals movie, everyone. Sorry.
Sponsored. This podcast has been sponsored by now. That because we're considered to be deviant, we have had to do a shitload of work of self-examination and to understand our sense of gender, to understand our sense of sexuality, to understand our sense of romance and attraction. And so therefore we actually have, generally speaking, a fairly robust sense of those dynamics of humanity. Whereas in cis-normative and heteronormative Christian context, their identities are so taken for granted that it's uncritically embraced. And so, straight and cisgender folk, Christians, need to stop and go, holy shit, we don't really know anything about what it means to say that we're straight or cisgender from a Christian perspective. We just have bought into this, cultural appropriated language from Scripture. And so even though it was painful, the gift of being queer in the church was that I do have a more robust sense of my own identity and understandings of sexuality, and why it's ridiculous when a Christian leader reduces it to preference, right? Like, this is about preference. Like
yeah.
It's so one-dimensional. Again, it's these little tiny categories. And so now I say to people, it's like I don't feel compelled to prove my identity to cisgender straight Christians, but I often push back and say, well, tell me, how much of your time and energy has been invested in exploring your own understanding of sexuality and gender from a Christian perspective? How much do you just simply believe is normal because that's who has the power? So that's been a huge part of it.
I mean, it's fascinating. Like what you're describing sounds like contemplation to me. So like the whole idea of contemplative spirituality is that you notice thoughts, feelings, instinct, whatever. And instead of judging, you kind of curiously give your attention to them. And then, that's kind of the whole contemplative thing. And then if for those of us who are more radically politically minded, maybe we might want to turn that curiosity outward so that we're noticing inward the things that are life-giving and not, and who we are with curiosity. And then the same outward. But Christianity tends to, as it's been inherited, bake us in to ways of seeing things. And so I understand why, like, it's funny, like contemplation could theoretically lead towards a sort of queering of spirituality. It doesn't necessarily, but I understand why a lot of traditionalist Christians hate contemplation as a framework, because it removes judgment as part of its presumption. But like this idea that, okay, if you're queer, you've had to do contemplation in order to survive.
Yeah.
So it's deeper than some sort of like, I traveled to New Mexico for a retreat one time.
Right. Exactly. And here's the thing. We've not only had to contemplate our own a sense of identities, we've had to contemplate straight cisgender identities, because in order to survive, we've had to learn to understand them. Our mutual, I think our mutual acquaintance, Drew Hart, in his book, The Troubles We See, he talks about being, talking to this pastor about race, and how the white pastor saying to Drew, who's African-American, like, you see your side of the cup and I see my side of the cup, and the journey is for us to help each other understand the other side. And Drew, in his brilliance, said, no, as a black man in America, not only do I know my side of the cup, I have to know your side of the cup. I have to know it well to survive. This isn't about two sides of people with equal power and equal opportunity. And that, to me, is such a brilliant way of viewing it. And so I think not only do we have the benefit or potential benefit of self-examination, but because we have had to point it outwards, I think we have a lot to say about these social constructs that are cisgender and heteronormative.
I mean, it's the liberation theology thing. If I can boil it down to a thing, the idea that somehow folks who are pushed out by dominant forces might have some insight into how that works.
Yeah.
And then also might have a way of encountering the divine or the good things in our world that might be worth paying attention to. And to me, this is where it's like, it's to me, it's this tragic thing. Like, not only did YWAM betray you, and this might sound judgmental, but they betrayed Jesus Christ. That's
Absolutely.
but in their betrayal of you, and not only, and they also betrayed themselves, because they believe Christianity is about a sense of precepts that have to be maintained and guarded, because it's like this sort of like controlled substance of grace that like the kind of weird way of looking at things. Whereas you and queer Christians in general have gifts about how to bring to these different groups about how we can encounter the divine in more powerful ways.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And with YWAM, one of the things that kind of opened my eyes to the internal hypocrisy was they kept reemphasizing that we love and have compassion for LGBTQ people. 100% we are not against the people. And then I said, okay, then how come there isn't a single YWAM ministry that's working to help the Rainbow Railroad, to help, because YWAM has connections all over the world. We could get people who are queer, who are in danger of oppression in their own countries. We could help get them out. And that has nothing to do with being affirming or not. It's just about saving lives. Is YWAM willing to participate? Well, I mean, they can if they want to. It's like, no, they can't. Talk is cheap, right? Like,
that's right.
If you want me to believe that you love queer people, show me where, and praying judgment doesn't cut it for me.
No. And it's interesting the way our own stories are kind of mirrored with each other. So like to me, there's so I would speak out about queer acceptance and things and like affirming, but I was perceived as a cishet person. And so even though there's some people who won't tolerate any of that, there's a lot of nice evangelicals who are like, well, you might be going too far, Mark, but I affirm you being compassionate.
Yes.
Well, and for you, it was like you were this queer person who was fighting the good fight against your own inner demons and sin. But and so they could tolerate that because they need to show that they can tolerate that, because it's part of the line that evangelicals want. Like, as long as you are part of, we're all sinners needing of salvation. As long as you're fighting against your own sin, that's fine. But then the moment you not only affirmed your own identity, but also queerness is a good thing. Boom. So it's like somehow if you bring together the critique and the embodiment, that's the double combo.
Yeah.
Of we need to annihilate you some way or another.
Yeah, absolutely.
Get you out of here.
Yeah.
And then we're going to use all this sort of standard bag of tricks. Like, it's the first person who came after me, like in a strong way, that was someone I was friends with. It's a Mennonite minister who brought up identity. Like, you keep talking about identity, gender identity. What about your identity in Christ?
In Christ.
Like me, I have my identity entirely in Christ. And it's that same thing you were talking about of like, well, no, you have all sorts of identity that you just don't even reflect upon.
Exactly.
And interestingly enough, when I came out, I didn't use the word identity.
Yeah.
So he was taking the culture wars stuff of like that somehow queer people are trying to constitute some sort of false sense of identity over and against and bring divisiveness into our sacred, hallowed sanctuaries. Yeah.
Well, and that's just it, right? Like, I have been very clear publicly saying that, like, I understand the deeply problematic aspects of identity politics and its fraught history, and but at the same time, sometimes that language is the only framework we have to throw some light against the massive principality and power in the Walter Wink meaning of the term that is cis heteronormativity. that it is this thing that they because they can't see it as a thing, they have a false sense of their own neutrality, and that we are
like
outside of it.
Or
exactly
toxic masculinity, these sorts of dominant modes that become the air we breathe, and so we don't even if it doesn't hurt you obviously enough, because that's the thing. Cis heteronormativity is like really damaging to most cis hetero people, because I don't think there's such a thing as cis hetero,
right? The
way we've constructed it. I mean, that's part of what queering does. And this is the danger of queerness, and framing things around queerness. Queerness isn't saying like there's this normal thing, and then we're some fringe people who need some freedom just to be weird. Queerness is like saying, no, the whole premise is fucked. Well,
to kind of lean into some of your work, to me, queerness is another term for prophetic imagination, right? Mm-hmm. Because it is the thing that resists, like it's the thing that says stop. It's the thing that is the naked prophet in the streets, right? Like it's the thing that, like, someone's like, how many more letters are we going to add to LGBTQ XYZ? I'm like, as many as is necessary until people stop putting us into categories and start saying that these categories are essential and that we are in subservient or subvalued categories. It's like, I'd love for the categories to disappear. I'm not naive to think that there'll never be categories. We need labels are part of language. I think we can separate categories from essentialist thinking. Like if you're at a restaurant and it says meat, you're going to want a label a little more specific, right? Like have a meat sandwich. So I'm not anti-label, but the reality is that queerness isn't the end for me. Queerness is the prophetic resistance to those normative power structures. It's just the thing that throws in the face of the assumptions.
To me, it's kind of a mystical thing. Like, this is part of the thing that people don't understand about what Jesus was about, is this sort of idea of like, look, we've inherited these sorts of precepts and things that were supposed to point us towards something, and we lost the plot.
Yeah.
And there is an anarchic or explosive, like, or holistic, however you want to look at it, there's different ways to look at it, way of breaking free from, as the Apostle Paul talked about the law being basically a tutor, to kind of get us to this fuller thing that Jesus was pointing to, and that this wasn't not to be replacement theology about it. I think this thing that is being pointed to is pointed to by the prophets. It's not, Jesus wasn't entirely novel when he was pointing to this stuff, right? So, but like queerness is a way of getting at that too. It's like, look, all this stuff, like, yes, there's monogamy is a good thing, but it's not the only thing to bring in that piece of it. Male and female is a thing, but it's not the only thing. And like and when maleness and femaleness gets baked in a way that becomes harmful, we have to ask, like, what does it even mean to be male and female?
Yeah.
And that question is incredibly explosive. I mean, but Jesus questioned that.
Yeah.
Paul, like, in his famed, like, there's neither male nor female, slave nor free, this idea that somehow every category of human relationship that's been tainted by sin, and what they meant was more this destructive force of domination and us being cut off from one another, from ourselves, from our relationship with God, with the land, that kind of sense of sin. We need to, like, blow this open and find entirely new ways of relating with one another.
Yeah,
like,
exactly.
And that's what queerness offers, but it's like, but of course that's threatening.
Well, yeah, queerness doesn't resolve the tension. Queerness exposes the tension or heightens the tension. Like, that's its role is not to fix anything, but to throw light on something. Again, that's why to me it's such a prophetic thing. And this is important. I know we'll be on the same page on this, and that's why as a queer white guy, I need to be aware of that queerness, that prophetic tension needs to turn my eyes towards the things that I perpetuate, right? Like, I can't tell you how many queer white men that I know who are massively racist.
No, it's a thing.
It is, because and this is deeply problematic and maybe a bit of a rabbit trail, but so much of the LGBTQ rights movement in the West relied upon leveraging whiteness to accomplish a version of equality that was simply mimicking heteronormativity, right? Like I'm happy that marriage equality happened, but to make the cis hetero model of relationship our final goal is to say everything you say about marriage and gender and stuff is right, and we're just tweaking it a little bit, but we're going to look like you.
Want in on it.
Exactly.
And again, just to get to Jesus again, like one of the things Jesus blew up most ardently is the standard understanding of what family is.
Yeah. Oh, wow. Did he ever?
I mean, this is, this is the sorts of things that fly over the head of people who are baked into patriarchy.
Yeah. But
if you're queer, you might notice it.
Yeah. Well, and there's a lot at stake. Like I realized from my own experience that there are people who genuinely are questioning those systems, but recognize to even question them could cost them their stability and their security and their community. And the number of people who are silenced to avoid that is massive. And so part of my and my wife's decision to, like, we know this is going to blow up our lives and it's going to be painful, is because the more people who do it, the more it creates space for others to step into it. And there are so, like, I remember even a friend of mine, she did workshops on like basically like poverty reduction from a Christian worldview. Like this is not tricky stuff, right? Like, but it included some, material on colonialism on the mission field and so forth.
Woo!
Yeah. and this woman was the head of her missions department. She was at this workshop and she was just like, her mind was open and she was like a convert, right? And then a year later, my friend ran into her and said, "Oh, so how did the church take it?" And she goes, "Oh, no, I resigned the minute I got home. There's no way I could bring that to my church. I still believe it, but I couldn't afford to lose my community by trying to convince them of that." And it's like, there's so much social tension around keeping people in line. And again, it's power. Following the power is something that will tell you a lot about the nature and character of something.
Mm-hmm. Well, Jamie, it was great talking to you.
Likewise.
I want to do a whole nother interview because we're scratching the surface. And I know we're of like minds, so it's just not like we're the same person, but we overlap enough to where I know we can.
Absolutely.
we can anticipate where we're going to go. So, this has been a pleasure and just a delight as always. And hopefully
Likewise.
Someday I'll be able to travel up to Winnipeg again.
Looking forward to it.
After the plague is over, perhaps. And if there's still maybe the United States will fall and I'll have to be a refugee to Canada.
Well, we've got lots of room for you.
Okay. Thank you.